We finished up with talking about how we see this real radical switch and how there's this constant turnover. That they were never really happy. Like they got a new government, it wasn't good enough. They wanted something new, it wasn't good enough. And so we see this constant turmoil going on in France, eventually leading to a very dangerous situation that pitted everybody against everybody. Turning on everybody. And so we're going to talk about in chapter 18, section 2, the section called A Move to Radicalism. A Move to Radicalism. You hear this term thrown around a lot today if you listen to any political chat or talk, is that there's this idea that anything that you say that is, far left or far right is very radical, right? It's way outside the box of thinking. And so we're gonna learn a little bit about where we saw that in France at the time. So the Paris Commune had forced the Legislative Assembly to call a national convention. The sans-culottes, remember, those are the people that talked about not being real formal, not rich, but that they were patriots, took other steps towards a more radical convention, a more radical revolution, I should say. The thousands of people were arrested and killed. New leaders such as Jean-Paul Marat, you can underline that guy's name, Jean-Paul Marat, encouraged the poor to use violence to get what they needed. All right, so there was this overwhelming attitude of violence. We can create violence. We can do bad. We can scare people into listening to us. All right. In September 1792, the newly elected National Convention began to meet. Although it had been created to draft a new constitution, it also acted as a ruling body of France. All right. So their original job was to just create this new government, but then they started acting as the government, as the rulers. All right. The convention was dominated by lawyers, professionals, property owners. So again, we see the rich leading in France. All right, we see the upper class taking over. So as much as they wanted a new revolution, it really didn't happen. Right? We see these, okay, we don't have a king or a queen, but we do see the rich are still in control. Almost all the deputies distrusted the king. So all the people that were in charge still didn't trust the king. The convention's first major step was to abolish the monarchy and establish a republic. All right, so that's good. So we get rid of the monarchy, but we do see that they're trying to bring in a republic, which is what we are. People that are voting, people that are all involved in the government. The Paris Commune favored a radical change and put constant pressure on the National Convention to adopt a more radical position. The National Convention didn't rule all of France. Peasants in Western France and people in France's major cities refused to accept the rule of the National Convention. So we see the National Convention is in charge, but are they really in charge, right? So they're basically saying they're in charge and they're putting themselves in charge, but in the end, they're not really in charge. They're really, paper leaders in essence, because a lot of people are fighting against them. They're saying, we don't listen to you. We don't want to believe you. We're not going to follow your rules. We're going to do whatever we want. All right. So the members of convention soon split into two factions. You're going to want to know these two factions. You can underline them, meaning that they were against each other. And it was pretty important because they were basically debating what would happen to the king. All right. Would they keep him alive or would they kill him? So the two most important factions were the Girondins and the Mountain. Those are the two different groups. Underline them, the Girondins and the Mountain. All right, both factions were members of what was called the Jacobin Club. So they were both part of this one group called the Jacobin Club, but they broke off into those two different groups, the Girondins and the Mountains. All right, the Girondins represented the provinces, which were outside of the cities, and they feared radical mobs in Paris and wanted to keep the king alive. So the Girondins wanted to keep the king alive. That is a very important thing. Make sure you understand that. You will see an essay about this, or at least a test question. The Girondins wanted to keep king alive. Very simple. All right? Which would mean that the Mountain then wanted to do what? Kill the king. All right? Quite literally, chop his head off. So the Mountain represented the radicals. And they won at the beginning of 1793 when they convinced the National Convention to go after the king, to kill the king. All right, so the convention condemns Louis XVI to death. He's beheaded by the guillotine. Do we know what the guillotine is? Shake some heads, say yes or no. The guillotine is the big metal sharp knife object that drops down and cuts people's heads off. All right, it became very popular in France during the French Revolution. Quite literally, blood flowed in the streets. They would do public executions, and we'll get into that in a little bit, maybe in the next set of notes. But it was pretty important to understand that, it started, we see this violent death of the king. So the execution of the king is carried out. This execution outraged other royalty in Europe. Again, we talked about that before. Why would other royalty be upset about the king getting killed? What did they think might happen to them? Exactly. I see some people doing that. You're right. A lot of people thought, well, if they're going to kill them, we're next. Our own people might come after us and kill us. All right. So an informal coalition of Austria, Prussia, Spain, Portugal, Britain, and the Dutch Republic. You don't need to know all those names, but just understand that a lot of countries came together and they were getting ready to invade France. All right. So the revolution didn't only take place in France. We see other countries starting to think what? We need to get really involved in this. We need to shut down this revolution, or else this could spill into our country. All right. So to meet the crisis, the National Convention gave broad powers to a special committee of 12. Underline this. They were known as the Committee of Public Safety. The Committee of Public Safety. All right. So interestingly enough, they call themselves the Committee of Public Safety. But this Committee of Public Safety, in turn, begins to really scare a lot of people to not think that they are safe. Pretty interesting. Kind of like when a group is called, we see groups today that are called that they're in charge of making sure that everybody feels like their voices are heard. But then a lot of what they end up doing is cutting off groups from being able to talk. Right? Whether you agree or not with certain people's opinions, America is based on this concept of, one of the concepts is free speech. So when we see groups coming into existence that want to get rid of free speech, but they put it under the guise of, well, it makes most people feel better, you kind of have to start wondering, well, do we really want to go down that road? Again, that's not saying that all speech is good, but, I've always been a proponent of that whole concept of, well, what then gets gotten rid of? What's then next? We've talked about that a lot. Not that everything is good speech, but if we get rid of one thing, what is then next? And so you gotta have to be smart about and wise about how you deal with that. So this group was dominated by a guy named Georges Danton. You'll want to know that name. And then next by a guy named Maximilien Robespierre. Two important names: Georges Danton and Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre eventually went by just that name, Robespierre. So kind of like when you hear Jordan, Michael Jordan. Most people don't have to call him Michael Jordan anymore. When somebody says the name Jordan, everybody knows the name, right? When somebody says MJ, that's where you kind of get these names from. You've kind of done a lot, whether good or bad. If I say Hitler, do I need to mention Adolf Hitler, or do you know who Hitler was? What do you think? Right? If I say Hitler, Hitler. Whether good or bad, people can be known by just one name when they've done good things or bad things. So again, just kind of know that when you hear Robespierre, that is about a person who rose to significant power during the French revolutions and the time after. And we're going to learn tomorrow, or the next time we bang into the notes, about why he became so popular, or that name became so known, and is still talked about today. So I'm done the notes for today. I'll stop them right there.